In this video, I want to talk about how we discuss both the position and the motion of joints. There's a fancy term for this. That fancy term is kinematics. We're talking about joint kinematics. And I like to remember this as being like the M's for the motion. So let's zoom in on the knee joint here. So knee flexion and extension. That's bending the knee like this and extending the knee like that, right? So quite often we'll want to talk about what angle is the knee at. So what is the knee joint angle? And I wish I could just tell you to memorize some set of universal standardized conventions. But unfortunately, in your career, you will encounter many different sources of information that use different joint angle conventions. So let's think about, let's say this knee angle right here. How would you describe this knee angle? Would you describe it as being, I don't know what this angle is, maybe 120 degrees? That seems reasonable. Bend your knee at 120 degrees. But you might also say you might also encounter people in different circumstances who would say, no, that's not 120 degrees. That's actually, that's bending the knee from straight by this much. It's bending the knee by 60 degrees. So this can be quite confusing. What I want to emphasize is that it is important to establish what your joint angle convention is. And a usual way to do that is to describe what is 0 degrees. What is 0 degrees? And what direction, meaning positive or negative, in this case, we would be interested in flexion and extension, right? Flexion, extension. So perhaps we define 0 as a totally straight leg. Then we would say, okay, this knee is at 60 degrees of flexion, right? And that actually happens to be the convention that's used over here in OpenSim. You will notice that if I go up to, let's say, the left knee joint, the left knee angle, it's at 0 degrees. And then if I increase it, that's moving in the direction of flexion. Now, you may use some other software. You may encounter some research paper or something that does not define this as 0, that defines it as 180 degrees, in which case then you'd be talking about 120 degrees of, say, knee extension. So establishing your joint angle conventions is very important. The other thing I want to talk about is the difference between being in extension or flexion and moving in the direction of. So let's say this is like the difference between joint position versus joint motion. A better joint to think about this at is going to be the hip joint, because the knee joint is kind of funny in that it actually can't go more than, let's say, 0 degrees using our convention here. Unless you have some type of hyperextensibility at your knee can't bend so it's like this. But the hip joint can bend like that, right? So suppose we define a joint, suppose we're talking about hip flexion and hip extension. And then let's suppose, so this means, by the way, we're rotating in the sagittal plane at the hip joint. So let's just define the anatomical position as 0 degrees. 0 degrees, and maybe we say moving into flexion. This is how you would define a joint joint angle conventions, by the way. You'd say, let's say flexion equals, and maybe I should follow whatever my software over here does, which I believe is flexion is a positive angle. Let's say flexion equals positive. So if I flex the knee like this, if I change this angle to, let's say, 10 degrees, that would be 10 degrees of hip flexion. I could extend the hip back like this, maybe 30 degrees of hip extension. Let me show you that. For the sake of clarity here, let me hide the muscles. And let's talk specifically about the left hip, this one. So we're at 0 degrees right now, because that's how we've defined our convention, our joint conventions. Now we're moving into extension, right? And then we can move into hip flexion, hip extension. Now this brings up an important point, which is the other thing I want to emphasize in this video, which is that there is a difference between being in hip extension versus moving in hip extension. So let me draw out a diagram. Let's take a really simplified, like here's the pelvis, here's the hip joint, and then let's say we have the hip extended like that. Maybe, I don't know, if this is vertical, maybe we're, I don't know, 30 degrees of hip extension. The thing that I need you to understand is that moving the hip like this, so say moving from 30 degrees like this to, let me pick a different color, say to 10 degrees. Moving from here to here, that is moving in the direction of, and I'll write that down, moving in the direction of, and think about this for a moment, hip flexion. Even though we have not crossed this, this sort of invisible line that sets the boundary between being, and I'll even do a different color for that. Let me draw a little diagram here. So over, like hip angles over here, this is being in hip extension. And over here, this, if the position of your hip is over here, then you're being in hip flexion. But I just want to emphasize that it's perfectly valid for me to talk about, say, moving the hip from here to here as being this motion, meaning moving this way. That's moving the hip in, that's flexing the hip. Even though when I'm done with that motion, I'm still in a position of hip extension. We could think about that at the knee joint also. So basically, no matter what angle the knee is at, it's going to be flexed by some amount, right? But if I had the knee over like, say this, say the foot's here and the shin is here, and then I moved it to where it's drawn right now, that would be extending the knee. All right, so when you do a squat and you're going back up, your knee is extending even though it's still in flexion. So the two things I want you to take away from this video are, number one, be very careful how you define your joint angle conventions. There's two pieces to that. Number one, what's 0 degrees? And number two, 0 degrees equals where? What joint position is 0 degrees? And number two, what is positive and negative? Is positive meaning flexion or extension? And you'll encounter this differently in different sources. So number one, be very careful about your joint angle conventions. Number two, realize that there is a difference between joint position and joint motion and how we describe things. And it's perfectly reasonable for the knee to be in a position of flexion, but for me to be extending it. Okay, so hopefully that's not too confusing, but it's important to get this technical stuff really squared away so we can talk about how the body's moving in 3 dimensions.